Ric Rac once adorned only vintage garments, but more recently it's come back in a big way. From the high street to catwalks and from mini to jumbo sized, it can be anything from a touch of contrast trim on the edge of a hem to a bold statement on the front of a bodice. I'm going to show you some simple techniques to help you achieve your Ric Rac vision. You can check out our blog post, which has lots of inspiration ideas too. The first method is stitched on, and this is the most straightforward one and can be used to create some really effective results. From a simple line on a cuff to layers of Ric Rac to create an ombre effect. First, you need to decide where you would like your Ric Rac to be placed. You can use a pen, a removable pen, and a ruler to draw a line to match to, or you can use a stitching line, which I'm going to do. You can match the edge of your Ric Rac to the line, or you can line it up along the middle. It's a little bit easier if you use the line on the points because then you get it really accurate. Once you're happy with your placement, you can pin your Ric Rac on, but I like to use fabric glue. I just find it doesn't pucker and it holds it in place better. So I place it on the Ric Rac, on the trim, rather than the fabric, which is just more stable. Place it along and then just ensuring that it's in position, and you can always lift it back up, put it back down again. Once I'm happy, then I can stitch on my Ric Rac. Before you start stitching, I'm going to place it under the machine and decide where the center is. So you want to get it right in the middle, so you're stitching right down the center of that Ric Rac. This is the method where we add it behind the hem. This is a fairly easy way to get a really nice effect, which can look like picot or a scallop depending on what Ric Rac you use. Here I've used a green to match, so it looks like part of the hem from a distance. Here I'm using a contrast colour for a different effect. We're simply going to measure your Ric Rac. I've gone a little bit longer and then I can trim, and we're going to place it behind to see how much we would like to see. So you can have less, or you can move it down to see a little bit more. And then we'll turn over and we're going to add some glue. And I add it to the Ric Rac rather than the fabric again. You can use pins, but I prefer to use glue. I find it doesn't move around as much. Then we're going to place it onto the back and then turn to check how much is visible. Just make sure it's even and then give it a press down. And you can move it up or down. Okay, and once that's in place, you can reinforce with some pins, and then we're going to stitch that on. This method is where we insert the Ric Rac into the actual hem. This is a clever trick to create a hem at the same time as adding the Ric Rac. The main fabric and the hem are separate pieces, and you will just need to work out how much fabric is needed. So you will need the depth of the hem by 2 and the seam allowance plus the seam allowance twice. And if you're adding this to a garment, you will need to lengthen the pieces to allow for the folded hem. First, we're going to lay the hem piece at the bottom and the main fabric over the top. And then using a fabric pen, we're going to draw in the seam allowance so we have a guide to match the Ric Rac up to. And then place your Ric Rac over the top, and anything above the line is what you're going to see once we're finished. It will make sense, I promise. So we're going to get that in position, and when you're happy with the position, we're going to stitch that down. So I've stitched down the Ric Rac just inside where the seam allowance line was, and then I'm going to turn over and we need to press the hem downwards. So I'm going to press that open. And we're going to turn over, and I need to press up this seam allowance. So using a pressing ruler, which can create a nice crisp line, I'm going to press up my hem. And then this is the bit where it starts to make sense. So we're going to bring up that line to meet the Ric Rac and make sure we just get what we want to see. So just matching it up with the edge of the Ric Rac there and press. We're going to edge stitch all along here for the finished hem. This method is for inserting Ric Rac inside the seam. It's great for areas like collars where you just want a little bit to be seen. It can take a bit more patience, but it's really worth the effort. The sample is shown on a curve. We need to think about how much Ric Rac you actually want to see. This one here with just a little bit creates a good picot effect. Marking your seam allowance here can be really helpful. You may just want to match your Ric Rac to the edge of the fabric, but always bearing in mind where that stitching line is going to be, because everything on the inside of that is what you're going to see. You may also want to think about if your fabric is a bit thicker, that you might need to move your Ric Rac in. Testing here is a good option. I've pinned my Ric Rac on here. I find pins work better than the glue for this because they just hold it in place better and stop it from shifting. Then once it's pinned, I'm going to stitch it on. You can use a longer stitch here just to baste it, but just inside that stitching line to really make sure it doesn't move. And once that's in place, I'm going to lay the second piece over the top. You can see here where I've got my 2 lines of stitching, so the original basting stitch inside and the stitching line here. And we're going to turn out and press the piece. So you can use a tool on the inside just to push it out, but I can do it with my fingers. Press all around and check, and you may find that there are parts that don't peek out quite as well. Just a little unpick on the inside, shift them out slightly, will rectify that. If you're making a collar, you may want to top stitch around the edge, and also think about where those points are going to be on the points of your collar, but I'm going to come up and show you a tip for that later. This method is a kind of floating Ric Rac effect. It's probably the most dramatic technique we're going to cover. You can see lots of inspiration for this on our blog. It looks great at the bottom of a sleeve or even the bottom of trousers. For this you can use a regular size Ric Rac or even a jumbo one, and you'll get a different effect with each. There is another method using a blind hem stitch, but I find that it's quite fiddly to try and catch it in the right places, and it can be quite fragile. With this method you can choose exactly how much of the Ric Rac you're going to catch, and it's a lot more stable. You will need to think about your pattern. Here I've got a small half scale version of a sleeve. You'll need to cut into where you want you to place your Ric Rac, so cutting across, and then add in the seam allowance or hem. So I've marked in my seam allowance or hem that I'm going to create here, and this is where I'm going to lay my Ric Rac over. Wherever you lay that Ric Rac, everything here is going to be visible from on this side. So this is where we decide how much of the Ric Rac we want to catch. So just laying a tiny bit over, we're only going to catch a small amount, and then we pin all that on. So I've stitched along that line, just catching the edges of the zigzag, and now we're going to press it. So I'm going to turn over and press that edge, and you can overlock that edge, but what's much nicer is to tuck that in and create a nice little neat hem all along. Just press, and then when you've pressed, you can edge stitch all along. And you can see that top stitching line there, and we're now going to, this piece is finished, we're going to join it onto the other. So we turn it so we have right sides together and place it over the top of the other piece with the tips of the Ric Rac just barely over that line again, the same distance. We're going to stitch exactly as we did before and finish in the same way. Then we edge stitch the other side as we did in the sample and give it a press, and it's all done. Finally, I have some tips on Ric Rac. My first top tip would be to plan. So have a play around with your Ric Rac. Think about what size you want to use and where you want to place it. You might want to just pin it on and see how it looks before you attach it. So playing around underneath or placing it over the top. You might want to think about if you've got 2 pieces coming together, are the points meeting or are they interlocking? Just really get an idea of how you want it to look before you attach it. You may need to pin Ric Rac into a corner, and I would suggest rather than starting here and working your way around, I've pinned it on already, but start in the middle and put a point into the corner and then pin this way and then this way. That way you can ensure you've got it right in the corner. When it's stitched on, we can turn out and you can see we've got it even on both sides. You may need to join your Ric Rac as well, unless it's at the end of a seam. Before you do, Ric Rac frays a lot. You can use something like fray check on the ends to stop it fraying. Just add it on, let it dry, and don't put it on any delicate surfaces. And then you can fold out of the way and match up where it meets on here, stitch down. Finally, you're not limited to just Ric Rac. You can add it to other trims, placing it underneath with the jumbo or placing Ric Rac behind another ribbon. There really is no limit to what you can do with it. I hope you found this helpful and you're inspired to make your own Ric Rac garments. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please like and subscribe. Do you have any tips for adding some trim to your own makes? We'd love to hear them in the comments below.